Hello, friends. Thanks for tuning in. Today I have a special guest with me. This is a gentleman whose work I've been following for many years, and I'm sure many of you have been following this gentleman for many years as well. He is the author of this very well-known publication, Anatomy Trains, and I'm very honored to introduce my special guest, Tom Myers. And Tom, thanks so much for taking the time. I know you're in traveling mode right now, right?
Yes, that's not unusual for me.
Yeah.
I call myself a white blood cell in the body human, and I travel around checking out the immune system and my own immune system all over the planet. But anyway, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for your wonderful work with people with Parkinson's. So you're to be congratulated as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's been a very gratifying experience. We're always learning and always growing because there's so much more we can do that we just don't know we can do yet. So, well, like I mentioned here, of course, this is not a book that I read. It's a book I study. I love this. I just love it. And one of the things that is has been very helpful to me is, and understanding as best as I can this material, and then bringing it to my workshops around the world to, just the knowledge, some of the knowledge from that will go into helping people to move better. So we know that in many cases, people start to lose, let's say their movement diminishes for some reason, the quality of movement is less than optimal. We see this in Parkinson's disease, of course. So what I wanted to do today, and we talked a little bit off camera first, I would love to talk about this whole idea of developmental movement. That post you put up recently about the children, and I can't remember where, but basically it had to do with not assisting children as much in movement. And then maybe eventually we can segue into when people lose movement, what can we do to help them get it back? Why don't we start with the assisting people less, assisting children less.
Yeah, let's do that, and then we'll go to how we get it back. I don't know if you are old enough to remember, but it used to be when I was a kid, my mom said, "You be back by the time the sun goes down," and
yes,
we went off into the woods. I grew up in rural Maine and went off into the woods and. I came back by the time the sun came down if I wasn't doing something more important. But the freedom of movement that kids had even 50 years ago when I was growing up was a whole lot more than today. After there was a terrible kidnapping of Megan, and those laws came in and were really circumscribed. So sure, there are people and we'll talk about that, people with neurological diseases that lose their movement, but kids are losing their ability to move just in the process of being in this society, because we go from building to building to building. We can't say to your kids, just go outside and play, because it's not, whether it is safe or not, that's a question. But it's not perceived as safe. So kids go from one activity to the other, and they're very cosseted in those activities, so that let nobody break a bone, let nobody, we just keep them within limits so that they don't move very much. So it's not only there's a whole argument about the quality of movement that I'm sure we'll get into, but just plain quantity of movement is not around. They did a study recently on a tribe in Ethiopia near the Omo River, and even with machetes and some fairly modern farming type methods, they're not a Stone Age culture, but they're as close to a Stone Age culture as we've got left. And they average 15,000. They put Fitbits on these people. They average 15,000 steps a day. Most are really working hard to get up to 12,000 steps a day. And the way the kids are moved around by car from one place to another, of course, there are wonderful things happening with extreme sports, what people are doing with skateboards and parkour and all of that these days is really great. But the majority of kids are not having enough movement and not having enough sense of risk, which is what that post was about that you were
Yes.
referring to. If you never allow your child to take a risk, they never have the feeling of an adventure. It's always a Disney adventure. It's an ersatz adventure. You know it's going to end up well in the end. Well, life isn't like that. You don't know it's going to end up well in the end.
No.
And although we don't want anybody breaking bones, I sure do want to see the kids climbing trees, climbing rocks and taking risks in order to build their movement, their basic movement skills.
I love that. I love what you're saying. Yeah, I'm 57, so I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and I know, we didn't even have an answering machine. We didn't have cable. We had 3 channels, and if we were lucky on a good day, if the weather was right and the cosmos were aligned, we had a 4th channel. So there wasn't a lot of TV to watch. And we were outside all the time, running in the woods down by the creek, playing games outside, riding our bicycles constantly. And we were moving all the time.
Yep.
And we not to go off on a tangent, but we had books, and we weren't like this all the time, right? Because
but Carl, you're 57, I'm 69, and I bet you're as addicted to your phone as I am.
Oh,
that whole digital thing didn't just happen to the kids; it happened to all of us. You take my phone away from me for a couple of days, and I'm shaking. I'm jonesing for my phone again. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to be connected, and I think this is temporary. I think that all that focus on the screen is something that's just as this technology is coming in. That we'll learn to use it in different ways. And I'm not worried about the kids with text thumb, and I am worried about the kids who are spending all this time like that, but I don't think it's going to last very, very long. I think we'll integrate with our tech in a better way. But we are human beings. We are 70 trillion cells trying to act in concert and be called Carl or Tom. And those 70 trillion cells, they need water gotten to them every minute. They need their garbage taken out. They need to know what's happening in their local area. They need to know what's happening overall in a general sense. And movement is I consider movement to be a food. I know there's an idea of movement as medicine. You practice movement as medicine for people with Parkinson's, but movement could also be considered to be a food like breath or the tea you're drinking or the anything that we eat. If you don't have enough movement, you don't have the nutrition that would keep your body healthy and whole by moving stuff around.
Exactly. Yeah, in fact, I got away from moving for many years. Before I got into what I do now, many years ago, I was a musician, a drummer, and drummers move, but you're sitting too, right? I had gained a lot of weight, wasn't working out the same way, and what I find myself doing now is going consciously trying to make sure that I move enough. Especially as I get older, that's a whole other thing. It's just easier to gain weight and things like that. But moving enough is very, very important. Staying moving, just keeping things going, because otherwise a lot of problems seem to develop for a lot of people.
Yeah, and then there are all kinds of movement systems out there. You can train hard in CrossFit. You can be moving slowly in yoga or Tai Chi. There's not one kind of movement that is good for everybody at all different times of their life.
True.
I was an academic, a head case, and I didn't do much moving at all. And when I had this kind of thing of if I get the urge to exercise, I just lie down for a while and it goes away. And when I got to about your age, I said, this is not working for me anymore. And I started 4-foot running. I run on the balls of my feet because I was reading the research that said you can build your fascial elasticity by that kind of movement. And I realized I was getting less elastic as I got older, getting less bouncy. And you think of your kids are bouncy, your grandma is not bouncy. So
Right.
I wanted to be more like the kids and less like grandma. So I started bouncing around on my feet, and it has really, I'm 70. I feel better than I felt at 55, and I keep quite a schedule, and a lot of it is on airplanes and in hotels, and you really have to work to keep yourself moving in that kind of environment. But by work, I mean you have to just set aside time for it,
Right.
because I get all the exercise I need in a hotel room.
Yes.
Even in a Japanese hotel room where you really don't have any room, you can set yourself to moving. And I really love, there's all kinds of people doing great work in movement, Ido Portal, and just lots of other people doing great work. And so I look for those kinds of basic movements, the developmental movements, animal type movements, what Emily Conrad called biomorphic movements, moving like all kinds of animals, insects, not just cheetahs and leopards, but all kinds of animals.
Yep.
And letting myself go through those fish-like movements or worm-like movements really revives my spine, because it's not enough just to do your traps, lats, pecs, and delts and your glutes. You really have to get into the center of the body if you want. At least that's how I feel it now at my age, is the inner movements closer to the spine, in the neck, jaw, in the breast, in the psoas and the pelvis. That those kinds of movements keep me healthy more than however much I can bench press.
Totally. This might be a good segue, because there's one thing that I teach, we teach in our Parkinson's courses is, let's say, how does this go? Optimal firing of muscles, nerves and muscles is for functional movement is much more important than having great strength in areas that do not coordinate movement. For example, if I can have Parkinson's or not, but let's just say I don't move well, but I can bench a lot of weight and I can pull down a lot of weight, and but that's not going to help me move better. So with that said, I love what you're talking about keeping the movements closer to the spine, or thinking of the center and the spine as a focal point of keeping that active and in shape. Let's segue over to people who lose movement and what we do to get it back. Again, we talked off camera in the beginning for a minute. With Parkinson's, we see a lot of times a rigidity of forward posture, asymmetrical gait pattern, shuffly steps a lot of times. But we see that with a lot of people, though. And so when you're working with somebody like that, what's your approach to getting them back towards more optimal movement?
Well, the first thing I want to say I really would like to make the division between those people with a neurological problem and those people without a neurological problem, just a movement problem. But with both, the first thing that I would say that applies to both is, what can they do? There's so much emphasis in physiotherapy and in any kind of corrective movement, even Pilates and yoga. Oh, well, you can't do this. You're doing your downward dog and your heels aren't on the floor. You're doing your stuff on the reformer, but you really ought to have your pelvis tucked under like this. There's all this emphasis on what you're not doing. Whenever I tackle anybody with a neurological problem, especially when I'm working with a child, I start with what they can do, and take something that they can do and maybe improve it a little bit, get them to do that better. But I don't start with the emphasis on what they can't do. And I think that has been really successful for me in working with both impaired and not impaired people, is to start with the things that feel easy and fun and that they like to do. And then we gradually move over, okay, well, could that knee come a little bit, you're crawling now, could that knee come up a little bit farther? Or what happens if you touch your elbow and your knee together? Then we can sort of add some fun that would take them into the area where they don't.
Well, I love that.
That's my first one.
That's your first one. I like that a lot, because I think when we can focus on what they can do psychologically, that helps too, because it's already for many people, not everyone. It's everyone has a different personality, but for a lot of them, just getting through the door to see you in the first place could have been a major thing for them. So if
Yep.
we encourage them and go with that approach of what they can do, I think that really sets the tone in a nice way where they know you care, and then they're just going to feel better. Then we gradually work into what they're not able to do as well and bring it in slowly. So that's your
Yeah.
first one. What's your next one?
Yeah, well, I just to finish up on that one, it's delight. You know, moving is not, if moving becomes a chore, then it's something that a hill they have to climb every morning, whenever they do it. If movement starts out as a delight, then more movement is more delight. If it starts
Yeah,
out as a chore, then more movement is more of a chore, and that's a
I
terrible thing
love
to do.
that. Actually, I love that. I might steal that and I'll give you credit every time I say it.
Okay,
But
please,
seriously, that's a great way to think about it.
please do steal it. I've stolen all of my stuff from other people. Um, the except the anatomy trains, people, somebody tried to say, oh, he stole the anatomy trains from site, and I really didn't. That there are people who have thought lines of muscles before me. I don't mean that, but I really did the research on that one myself.
Oh,
Most of the other stuff, you know, we all they say if you steal from one person, that's plagiarism. If you steal from 10 people, that's scholarship. But if you steal from 100 people, that's original research. So I've stolen, I've stolen from at least 100 people on this. Okay, the next thing that I would say gets into my domain, which is if somebody hasn't been moving for a long time, and that includes people with Parkinson's, but it also includes those of us who've been sitting in an office chair for all these years, or
sure.
driving for 8 hours a day for a long time. Or for me, it's sitting in airplanes for 16 hours at a time. If you haven't been moving for a long time, and I don't mean 16 hours, I mean this bit hasn't moved for months and months and years, it's not just a neuromuscular problem. That was the insight of Ida Rolf that I studied with, is that if it gets there for long enough, it becomes part of the fabric of the body. And I don't mean just the psychological fabric, it becomes
Sure.
part of the actual physical fabric of the body, which is called fascia. And that fascia gets sticky and it gets thick. Those are, you know, there's been a lot of press about fascia, a lot of noise about fascia. It gets sticky and it gets thick. When it gets sticky, it won't slide on itself. When it gets thick, everything nets together and it looks like felt, and it won't move in the way that the body was designed to move. So Antonio Stecco, for instance, is working with Parkinson's folks, and he's injecting an enzyme, hyaluronidase, to break up the sticky part of the fascia so that the spastic paresis will come out of the muscles and they'll be able perhaps to move voluntarily better. Now, I don't inject people with hyaluronidase. I use my hands and I go after the places that have been stuck together, and by holding one part in place and getting them to move, I get those two bits to move on each other and restore that movement. And that's what I teach. That's my stock in trade. That was part of the insight of Ida Rolf. So I think it's really good if people start out with some stuff that really opens up, if they haven't been moving for a long time, to start out with some of the stuff that opens up the fascia. Or conversely, don't expect them to move in a complete way when they're moving against the fabric. The muscles are weak, the mind is weak, and the fabric is strong. So you're setting people up for failure if you're trying to push them to move too much too soon. And if we can get this tissue to open up, then the neuromuscular stuff becomes easier to work with.
I love that. Wow. Lots of knowledge bombs and brain candy here. Yeah, I love this. So you know what? There's something I'm having a random thought here, and I'd like to go back to a few minutes ago when you were talking about running on your forefoot and bouncing on your feet. And
Yep.
I'll tie it in with what we're talking about right now in a second. But can you explain a little bit more about what do you do when you're like, let's say you're on a trip, you're in Japan, you're in a hotel room,
Yep.
you want to bounce on your feet. Do you bounce on your feet? Do you like run in place? Is it something like that? Or if you're able to get out, are you going to be running outside, bouncing on the balls of your feet or forefoot running?
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to be outside if I can, just because I like being outside. And if
Mhm.
I'm in a foreign country, then I get to see things.
Yeah,
I'll be out there on the street with I either use a regular minimum shoe or those five-fingered thingies,
hmm,
um, and so that there's really very little between me and the ground, but enough to protect me if I'm on a city street.
sure.
And then I literally, my heels do not touch the ground during my run. Um,
That
so
was my
I'm
next question. So you're totally avoiding heel contact.
for the purposes of this kind of running, I don't avoid heel contact for the rest of the day. But
Right,
for
right,
the
sure. During the running, yeah.
but let me tell you why. Because when I do that, for instance, when I'm bouncing and my heel is up in the air, um, the Achilles tendon is getting a little longer and bouncing back, a little longer and bouncing back, a little longer and bouncing back, and the muscle, the soleus and the gastrocnemius that
Sure.
hold the Achilles tendon,
Hmm.
actually doing an isometric contraction, not a concentric contraction. I'm not pushing myself off with my soleus. I'm bouncing onto the tendon. The tendon gets a little longer, and then it gives back that elastic energy.
So
So
the elastic
uh,
recoil kicks in.
the elastic recoil kicks in. So I'm training my body in elastic recoil. I'm not training myself. If I want to do aerobic training, then I should get on a bicycle or do something where I'm not bouncing on my fascia, because bouncing on your fascia is so efficient. You're not using up the sugar or putting that much of a strain on your body. It's
Um,
building the elasticity in my ligaments, which have kept me feeling more bouncy just in general.
find
But
myself sitting here. I'm actually.
if I,
Oh,
just
go
let me
ahead.
answer the other one.
Sure.
If I cannot get out, then jumping rope is the what I just
Ah,
take a jump rope. Easy thing to take in a suitcase, and so that gets my bouncing in if I can't go out at
ah,
night.
that's great. That's great. Actually, that's something that I do fairly often, and one of my lead instructor, Allison, she does that all the time. Of course, it's just a great cardio thing too. You can get your heart rate up pretty quickly.
Yep.
Uh, but I find myself sitting here trying to push into the ground, so I have to stand up and try this. This. Okay, I'm going to work on this because I think that whole idea of running. It's funny. Just yesterday morning, a friend of mine was saying to me, I was just reading about running on your forefoot, and having worked well, it doesn't really matter. I had to think about it, and then today you're talking about this, so now I have to tell her that she's on to something. This is great. This is really great, man. So,
I just want to emphasize that's not the only thing that I do. I'm not advocating that over something else. But once we understand the body,
mhm,
which means understanding the fascia and understanding our neuromuscular thing, we'll maybe have an idea. We'll have a better idea than we have now about how much of what each person needs in terms of movement. I don't
yeah,
think there's not. I said this earlier, but there's not one prescription for everybody for movement. It's different in different times of your life and different genetics that you have, and we need to figure that out. And we're only just beginning. We just sent everybody out into movement. Well, in the old paleo days, you were chasing down game and out gathering herbs and washing your clothes in the river and all of that. So you had plenty of exercise. And then we got to the farming region about 10,000 years ago. We all started farming, and we were still swinging scythes and bringing home the harvest and all of that. So we were still moving a lot. You know why we take summer off in school? Because you went to the fields and you
oh,
helped in the fields. You didn't play all summer.
you're
You needed
working.
to get because you
Yeah,
were needed at home to work in the field. So as we then we went into the industrial era, and now we are doing repetitive motion on assembly line, and all of
hmm,
our exercises became like jumping jacks and burpees and things that were designed to have us do repetitive movement. Now we're entering this electronic age where we're all married to our phones. What kind of movement do we need for that? Well, we don't need repetitive movement. The machines are doing that. We don't need farming movement. Machines are doing that. What do we need? We need human movement, which is actually more original. So can we get our kids into some kind of dancing or some kind of exploration inside themselves? I think physical education is really going to change just because of the phones, not because of the phones per se, but because we're beginning to think about the body in a different way. We're not thinking about it as a machine so much.
Really, really interesting when you go through a timeline like that of farming, before farming to industrial to now. That's, you know, I never even thought about the fact that a jumping jack probably wasn't around 150 years ago, right? Who did jumping jacks? Who started that? And a lot of the other stuff out there. We've had to design exercise to, you know, CrossFit wasn't around 50 years ago, 30 years ago.
It really wasn't. It's hard to you know, I'm so old now that I remember these things, but there wasn't any exercise for women. It was when Jane Fonda came in with aerobics that all of a sudden exercise became okay for women. Before that, exercise was men, sweaty, pumping iron inside a gym.
Yeah.
You didn't see women outside exercising. Oh, they played, you know, some played tennis and things like that, but it was not a general thing. It really came in with aerobics that it became okay for women to exercise, and then all those clothes and all the accoutrements, and then gyms were trying to get women in and all that kind of thing. But this has changed significantly even within the span of my lifetime.
Me, you know, now that you mentioned that, me too, because I remember the early 80s, I think it might have been, Jane Fonda. Yeah. That was all over TV, you know. Yeah. So you could buy the VHS tapes probably at the time or something like
that. Betamax or something.
Yeah, who remembers Beta? Not many of us. But yeah, it was out there. Well, okay, so let's, as we come towards closing out, let's say here. I love everything you've shared. It's just so insightful. This has got me thinking about a lot of different things. So let's go back to the regaining movement. Is there anything you would like to share? You talked about what people can do and working with them in that regard first, just to kind of set the tone, get them more involved. What's the next in line for you? What's the next thing you're going to do to help somebody regain some movement?
Well, then we have to look at once they're enthusiastic about movement, then we have to look at very basic things. Now, standing is a movement. Standing still is a movement, and many people are doing that in an inefficient way, where their head is forward, the chest falls. That affects the breathing. Then the lower back has to tighten up to keep the head on. Then you go to the doctor or you go to the chiropractor and you say, oh, I got a lower back problem, and the person is not looking at your neck. This is a whole pattern. The first thing we have to do is think in whole pattern terms. If somebody is not moving in their feet, they're not going to be moving in their hips and their low back well. So do I work on the hips and low back, or do I help them with their feet, put a ball under their feet? So getting your feet have 28 bones in them, and there's a reason for that. If they were meant to be still, then we could have done it with, God would have done it with one bone, but there's 28 bones in there, and yet we take those feet and we put them in sensory deprivation chambers every day and lace them up.
Very true.
Then the bones don't move with each other. So getting people's feet to be a little more prehensile, a little more like hands with a bit more sensation in them is certainly an early one for me. A second one is sitting. Most people in the industrialized world today sit, as you and I are now, a great deal of the time, and yet nobody ever taught them how to use a chair or how to use the body in a chair. So the second thing I'm going to do is use Feldenkrais's pelvic clock or other exercises that people have developed for getting the pelvis under your body. Because so many, I'll go back to the kids now with their phones, so many of them are sitting back on their tailbone with the back flexed into position.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a recipe for not being able to use your hips. So, so getting them to like movement, that was the first one we talked about, getting their feet moving. And then the third one in sitting is, can they sit slowly from stand to sitting? Because most people, I'm going to go out of your picture here, but most people go into the chair.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Land in the chair, and they throw themselves out of the chair. When you do that, you are short-circuiting the muscles in your hips, the little muscles underneath the glutes in the back, and the psoas and the pectineus and iliacus in front. All of these muscles get atrophied for where they need to be for you to actually sit. And I think that the chairs are causing the pandemic, or people's misuse of chairs is causing the pandemic of hip replacements that we're getting. The argument for so many hip replacements is, oh, well, we're living much longer than we used to, and your hips are running, your hips get to their sell-by date. And that's just such a bunch of crap. Hips will work just fine. Knees will work just fine if you use them properly. Of course, they can be injured. Of course, things can happen. I'm not saying that. And surgery can be really, really helpful when those things do happen. But we've got a bunch of people who are just having degenerative arthritis in their hips and knees, and it's not because they're living too long. It's because they're not using their hips and knees properly in their daily life. And so that's the part that runs out.
Right. That's beautiful. Just, I'm really glad you said that, because I think that's just so important. There are things that a lot of us, they get left out. Excuse me. Things that average, let's say, the medical community, and not to knock them. My son is a doctor in Atlanta, and we need my son. We need the doctors out there, but the medical community at large they don't look at these things. They're not looking at how we sit. I know just going off for a minute, I work with a lot of people with neurological disorders, especially if they're in a wheelchair. But if they can stand, we're working to get them to, even if it's assisted a little bit, because we have to at first, to help them up out of the chair slow, but then down slow, because we want to strengthen that area. We want to coordinate those areas to be able to hopefully get them back to moving a little bit better, because sometimes it's not all lost, and they may have a degenerative condition, but they can still improve movement. So that gets
absolutely
lost.
And what sometimes gets missing in those Parkinson's patients is the musicality of the movement. I find music so helpful with people with neurological problems, because somehow that rhythm coming into the ears connects to the movement part of the brain, and it seems to be very helpful to have them move in a rhythmic way, or to move with music to help improve those neurological deficits.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. I think it may be the third or fourth slide of our presentation talks about music and movement and the connection, movement and learning and the connection, because I know I learn better when I'm moving. If I have moved a lot, if I sit all day, I don't learn as well. There's all kinds
absolutely. Whenever I go on my classes, I tell people to get up, move, but you're not going to offend me if you're doing yoga in the corner, or you're rolling around, or you need to get out and walk for 10 minutes and then come back.
Yeah.
I regard that as good self-care, and not that's not an insult to me.
Oh, I love that. Well, let me. I'm going to ask you one more question, and that question is, what advice, if you could, let's say, deliver any particular one piece of advice, words of wisdom, what would that be for the movement specialists out there, the manual therapists? What is your message?
Keep going. Don't get discouraged. This is the absolute task of the 21st century. Your son is a doctor, and I'm so glad that they're working with chemistry, and my God, they're doing amazing things with chemistry. And I'm so glad that my cousin is a psychiatrist, and their psychologists and all that are doing wonderful work with how people communicate. But this is the century in which we need to learn how movement works, because it's the key to changing behavior. It is the key to health. And because of the way that people are not moving, it is the biggest threat to health, in my opinion. We can argue whether nutrition is or whether movement is, but it's what people are doing when they're helping other people to move is so important. Keep going, keep studying, keep working. This is a really, really good field to be in right now.
Well, I love that advice. I feel the same way, actually, and it's one of the reasons I'm talking with you is because I want to learn more, and I know the people who watch this series, they want to learn more. And so your time here, your knowledge, we appreciate so much this sharing with us today, Tom.
It's been a great pleasure talking with you, Carl, and greetings to the folks who are listening, and thanks a lot, and keep going.
Yeah, well, I love those words with them. Keep going. It might be another one I steal from you. I'll give you credit, though. Well, it's funny when you talk about stealing or taking things from other people. I have in my workshops, I say, by the way, I didn't make any of this up. I had one original thought. When I get to that slide, I'll make a big deal out of it. But the 168 other slides, it's all somebody else's stuff.
Yeah.
So,
but that's it, Carl. We're part of a tide that's coming now, and well, there are two tides. There's a tide that's taking people away from their bodies, putting them into the electronics, getting them to sit more and move less, and we're part of the tide that are getting people to move more. And it's irreducible that we have a body. We all have a body. Rich people have a body, poor people have a body, old people have a body, young people have a body, and so keeping that body healthy is the irreducible fact of being a human.
I love that, man. So one last thing here. I want to make sure I mention, of course, Anatomy Trains. If people want to know more about your workshops or any of the anything that you have out there that's available for people reading, listening, watching live events, where should they go?
To anatomytrains.com.
Okay.
We have all of our courses listed there. We're worldwide. We have an office in Europe and an office in Australia, and we do courses all over the world. I have about 20 teachers, including Simone, who's a friend of yours.
Awesome. Yeah, she's great.
Yeah, who's they're all lovely people. And the only other thing that I would want to plug is, if you really want to understand the body, get yourself to a dissection. We run dissections, but other people run dissections too. I'm not touting mine more than other people's, but you really see the body for what it is, and the body in the books is not the same as the body as lived. So obviously when you're dissecting somebody who's no longer living, but you see how the living tissue works. It's been a revelation for me, and lots of the people who have come to these dissections have really gotten a lot out of them. So if you can make a visit to Boulder with us sometime, we'd love to see you.
Okay, so those are on your website, right? Do you have those?
Yeah.
Okay.
My whole life is on my website, yes.
Okay, yeah, as a matter of fact, I've had people come to my workshops who have been to your workshops for the actually the dissection labs. And that every person who's been to yours and came to mine added so much to mine. So thank you, because now I need to get to yours because I want to understand this better as well. I want to get my team to come out and attend because, yeah, I know it'll be very powerful.
We have a lot of emphasis on the fascia, and we're using cadavers that have not been dipped in formaldehyde. So one, it's a lot easier on you. You're not breathing in all that chemistry. But secondly, the body moves as normally. It's not a stiff cadaver. You can see the joints move. You can see what happens. Okay, when I take off this muscle, does the joint move better? You can see how the fascial layers attach to each other. You can see how tendons really work. The books have been cleaned up in a way that our anatomy books, our anatomy atlases, have been cleaned up in a way that is not real. So
okay,
the word autopsy means see for yourself, and I urge people to come see for yourself.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. So anatomytrains.com is the website. You can find out about all of Tom's events, live events, books, all materials. Your whole life is on your website, you said. So we can send people there to find out what you have. Once again, thank you so much, Tom. I really appreciate this. This has been a fantastic.
Thank you, Carl, and thank you for your work.
Well, thank you, and thank you everyone for watching, and have a fantastic day.